Hello, thanks for joining us for a special report online. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. It's a great place to be. Continue the conversation with our panel. We want to hear from you, so weigh in, ask questions, make comments. Don't worry if you don't see it right away. The producers are getting it in as fast as we can, and we'll bring it here with the panel. Steve, Julie, and Charles. Let's go back to the debate and wrapping it up. I want to play Carly Fiorina. We didn't talk about her a lot, but she had a pretty good night by all accounts. Here she is making a case about what needs to happen with regulations and top-to-bottom review.
In addition to rolling back what President Obama has done, we need to do a top-to-bottom review of every single regulation on the books. We've become a nation of rules, not a nation of laws. And finally, we actually, yes, have to hold government officials accountable for their performance. All this has to be done, and the citizens of this nation must help a President Fiorina get it done. We must take our government back.
Now, as a moderator, when you hear those bells, you know that they have blown past the time. There were a couple of two-bell answers there, Julie, for Carly Fiorina, but she held her own, and she was impressive.
And she's been impressive in the debates. These are really good settings for her. The challenge for Carly is that she hasn't been able to take these strong performances and turn them into more support in polls in early states. Her campaign is still lacking a strong infrastructure, but I think at the very least, she's set herself up to play a really important role in the Republican Party through this election. She's not just a talented Republican woman, which I think is important, but she's also just a very effective communicator, particularly when she's talking about Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, Charles?
I think that's right. I think she would be she would be on a very short list of vice presidential candidates. She can say things as a woman that the men can't say about Hillary. That's just a fact of our sort of political culture. And she wants to do that. She is just itching to go after Hillary. So I think she'd be offering a lot as a number two. But also, as you say, in the future of the party, she would be a really good cabinet member. Just thinking about our discussion that we had on the show about the VA, I mean, her whole campaign is that there's a sickness, kind of a sclerosis in a bureaucratic system where we have sort of grown over the century, almost a century of the New Deal and with the welfare state, that we have these massive structures that are now unresponsive and immovable. She sees really that, even more than ideology, as the problem that's afflicting the country. And she wants to go out there. The zero-based budgeting is a way of saying, I want to demolish all of these institutions. I would turn her loose. I'd start her on the first day on the VA and abolish it if it had to be abolished. With a national card everybody could carry.
But I mean, Charles, you're talking about her as possible number two on the ticket, then possible cabinet member. Right. You are not talking about a possible presidential candidate.
For the reason that, well, three reasons actually.
Really? Let me count the ways.
No. That was a joke. I can only remember one. What Julie was saying is she has not been able in each of these appearances. She does really well. Her numbers go way up and then they go down. She doesn't have the infrastructure. I guess she could be on the outside, and there are a couple of outside candidates. She perhaps, Christie perhaps, who got dropped into the lower tier. And I would even say that Jeb is now one of the longer shots. That's the long shot tier. What you have apart from those is you have the second tier, which is Rubio and Cruz, which, as you indicated, Cruz is setting it up as a showdown between them. And then the two at the top, the anti-establishment types. And that's what the field is right now. I think it really is down to four, realistically, the top tier and the two Cuban Americans. But perhaps still, I mean, it's early, so a long shot.
Doug, 1959, writes in, has Carly lost her mojo? She was awesome in the debate, but can she get the buzz back, to Charles' point?
Yeah, so I don't think she's lost her mojo. But what I do think she's lost is her novelty. I mean, when she first burst on the scene in the undercard debate and then in her first debate on the main stage, she was fantastic. She did basically what she did last night, but we hadn't seen it before. I mean, we'd seen it before, but those of us who'd seen her speak, but the general public hadn't seen her before. So there was all of this buzz. She's giving the same kinds of answers, the same quality, but people have seen it before. And it almost sometimes, last night watching it, there were a couple moments where I saw her giving an answer and it almost felt formulaic.
Yeah.
She's got a very effective way of simplifying very complicated issues, but she will repeat herself, or she'll give lists. I have 3 solutions for this. I have 4 solutions for this. It's very effective generally, but I think that might help explain why she's not getting the bounce that she was getting earlier. But can I just say real quickly something about what Charles said? You're 100% right on Carly, on the administrative state. And it's a passion of hers.
Yes.
And if you ever hear her talk about this at length, it sounds like the most boring possible thing to talk about. How do you dismantle a bureaucracy?
Yeah.
How do you take on the administrative state? She has detailed plans that certainly sound good, but she's also one of the only Republicans who's talking about that. I would argue that dismantling the administrative state, making government once again responsible to the people who are elected to govern, is in many ways the top, or one of the top couple issues. She talks about it in a way that actually makes it interesting and, dare I say, sexy, and it's tremendously effective if she can do it at greter length with a bigger audience.
What's interesting?
A trigger warning before saying.
Probably right.
It's interesting, Julie. I hear criticism of Carly Fiorina and even Rubio, sometimes Cruz, that they're too programmatic, that they deliver mini speeches and they've got it and they just push a button and they go, okay, got this one, and they go with whatever speech. But then the other criticism is that somebody doesn't have the facts and figures, like a Ben Carson or a Donald Trump, and he's too off the cuff. So what are we looking at? Like the porridge is too hot or cold?
It's funny. We were talking about this in the AP newsroom last night after the debate, because I covered Obama as a candidate for both of his presidential campaigns. And the one thing that Obama was really good at, whatever you think about Obama, is he could define what his message was. No matter what you thought about him, you liked him or you didn't, you knew what he was saying. And Rubio's got that same talent. I think Cruz has it, Carly has it. Part of being a good presidential candidate is saying the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. You ask people about Rubio, they kind of are starting to know the story. You ask people about Jeb Bush, I'm not sure they know the Jeb Bush message. I'm not sure they can rattle off what he would want to do as president. So yes, for those of us who have to listen to these speeches and these debates
ad nauseum,
it gets a little old, but as a political strategy for connecting and getting your message across, I actually think it's very effective.
It's very funny. For any reporter who's ever covered a presidential campaign, or any campaign for that matter, you hear the same speech again and again and again. You hear it all the time. But then they say something different, one line, and you're like, wait, that's it.
You wake up
There's
from the
fog. Story.
Yeah.
And it's one sentence in like paragraph after paragraph. But some people, we have to remember, don't hear the speech every day.
That's why the late night comics have such a gimme, such an easy way to embarrass any candidate. All you do is you play the same soundbite from 20 speeches, and they all look like dunces. But of course, if you're going to give 20 speeches a day, there's no way in God's name that you're going to give a different speech. And you're right, even in the debates, Rubio acts on the assumption that no one knows that the father was a bartender and the mother was a maid. We've heard it maybe 100 times, and it sounds old, and it also sounds. When you've heard it 100 times, you have to ask yourself, how authentic is it? But that's the job of a candidate. You got to assume your audience has never seen you.
And there's almost an inverse relationship between how many times we hear it and what the public is getting. When I sit in a speech that I've heard for the 20th time, out in Iowa or New Hampshire or South Carolina, every time I hear the same speech, I'm thinking to myself, the more sick I become of this speech, the more it's penetrating to people who aren't doing what we're doing, who aren't listening to every single speech or not watching it every time. I don't know. In the Democratic race, when John Edwards said 2 Americas, if he said one more time that we live in 2 Americas, I was going to go to the other America, because I was done listening to it. Right. Yeah. And
But I get what you're saying. It has to bleed through.
You have to, I mean, this is what Julie's point is. You have to have this core message, and the more you say it, the more people get it, the more they talk about it, the more they recognize it. And, you know, if it's a good message, it doesn't mean that it's going to work. I mean, you could repeat a terrible message a bunch of times and lose. Yeah. But if it's a good message, I think that's
But you're right. And when you hear one thing new, you go, oh, my God, something good. And it actually happened last night. When Cruz did the thing about the sugar subsidies, which we had never heard, at least in debates, you knew this is like a turn in his strategy.
Well, let's listen to that because we have it.
Sugar subsidies. Sugar farmers farm on roughly 0.2% of the farmland in America, and yet they give 40% of the lobbying money. That sort of corporate welfare is why we're bankrupting our kids and grandkids. I would end those subsidies to pay for defending this nation.
Now, he didn't even tie that to Rubio.
Yeah, but
the brilliance of that, he just turned and talked about what Rubio was talking about and like laid the groundwork for sugar subsidies to come.
Those of us who live in the weeds of this campaign knew exactly what he was doing because Rubio is pro-sugar subsidies, and the story is that a lot of his support is from the sugar lobby because he supports
from Florida and from Miami.
Right, so it's a natural thing. But, I mean, it was, you said to yourself, oh, I see what he's doing. He's assuming the top two guys eventually will wither away. He will inherit a lot of that, and then it's him and Rubio, the mano a mano. And he's just teeing it up for next time. So it is interesting. If you hear the same thing over and over again, and then you get one thing out of the blue, you know you've got, there's a story here.
Santa Barbara Dave says the bell has to go. Dave, I tell you, it's tough.
You gotta have it.
I like the bell.
It keeps everybody on track, and at least they know, and at least you know at home that they are totally abusing their time. And then the most popular word in a debate is not "Thank you, Senator," "Thank you, Senator," "Thank you, Governor," "Thank you, Governor."
That's
thank you,
horrible.
Thank you. That's pretty tough.
That's really annoying, and it makes the viewers hate you.
The best was when Carly kept talking over the bell. She was talking about the importance of rules.
Yeah.
You know, Carly set it up by saying, I have a 5-point plan. Do you remember that?
She? Yes.
And she never got to the 5th.
Oh. Really?
Yeah, I think if you go back and look at the I haven't checked it, but I was listening and I was counting when she said it.
I was counting the bells. I heard 2 bells.
It's a rule, ironclad rule. Never say how many.
That's a good.
You won't get there.
That's a good test. All right, I want to go to the immigration issue and Trump and Kasich early in the debate and this back and forth.
Frankly, we have to stop illegal immigration. It's hurting us economically. It's hurting us from every standpoint. It's causing tremendous difficulty with respect to drugs and what that does to many of our inner cities in particular.
You know, the answer really is, if they've been law-abiding, they pay a penalty, they get to stay, we protect the wall, anybody else comes over, they go back. But for the 11 million people, come on, folks. We all know you can't pick them up and ship them back across the border. It's a silly argument.
Now, arguably, that moment was Kasich's best moment. But the rest of the debate, I don't know what happened.
Kasich. Kasich's in a tough spot because he needs a breakout moment. He's floundering, doing okay in New Hampshire, but, you know, not doing great. So he needs to break out. But Kasich's way of breaking out is basically to like throw himself onto the floor in the debate essentially and say, I'm here still and I'm going to just keep talking. And I think it turned a lot of people off. There are ways to do it that are a little more subtle. And he, in some ways, ended up just looking desperate and angry and frustrated. And that's not the impression you want to leave.
He got to the point, I mean, the word that kept coming to my head as I was watching him, it's really not a charitable description, was he was annoying. Like every time he jumped in and spoke up, I was just annoyed. And you shouldn't feel that way about a presidential candidate in a serious presidential debate.
Or let alone someone who's you're going to make president and you're going to listen to for 4 years.
Right. You think of this person as somebody who's going to run. I think actually the debate might have really, he's not going to be president. He's not going to be the nominee. I think it might have longer term implications because Kasich is going to be on everybody's short list for vice president. I mean, he's in Ohio. He won re-election with 69% of the vote. You know, he's got a pretty good record. People are going to want that. I mean, Ohio Republicans need to win Ohio. And I wonder if people will remember back to this debate and the ones that preceded it and think, can I imagine him on the stage against one of the Castro brothers debating Hillary Clinton's vice presidential nominee?
It's not just his tone and tenor. It is what he's fighting on. Right. I mean, he's kind of like an angry John Huntsman. I mean, he is fighting his own base of his party on a lot of things, and that can be admirable. But it's a really tough uphill battle if you also don't have the tone and tenor or nuance to be able to pull it off. Is that fair?
I was thinking of him as a conservative Bernie Sanders, actually a conservative Larry David, with those hand gestures. I mean, I thought he was going to actually injure somebody on the stage with the finger pointing and the waving. And the word really is hectoring, and you're absolutely right. There was something annoying about it. The other thing is ideologically, he's real centrist. And he made look at the cases he made. Essentially for amnesty. He's making a case for expanded government. He talked in the past about Medicaid expansion. And also, there's a kind of a moral condescension when he says, when you get to the gates of St. Peter, he's not going to ask you, did you shrink government? Did you help the poor? Well, in heaven, they don't have a $19 trillion deficit. If they did, then they might have an adjustment to the moral rules. So I think it's that tone. It goes with the hectoring that he's morally superior. And Republicans who don't generally agree with his positions but might want to listen to it, they would if they didn't feel that he's essentially accusing them of being, immoral or insensitive or not really good Christians.
Inferior. There was also this point in the exchange on the bank bailouts where he basically said, I'd bail out the banks if I had to.
With Ted Cruz.
With Ted Cruz, where I thought Cruz got the better of that, although he had to he gave a definitive answer and then had to sort of slowly walk it back. Kasich made an argument that, this goes to Charles' point, against the base of his party, against having a governing philosophy at all. He said, philosophies don't work when you have to get something done. And I just thought, listening to that, boy, I think voters are going to want somebody who's got a vision and who has this sort of guiding principles that will help him or her make decisions. And Kasich at one point also said, in effect, you elect me, I will be the one to choose who merits a bailout and who doesn't. I mean, it was adopting this paternalistic tone and paternalistic substantive argument that you just don't often see on a Republican primary stage.
I agree. It was off the rails at a couple points. Terry in Maryland says Carson never set the bell off. And you're right, Terry, he didn't. He never used his full 90 seconds or 60 seconds on the follow-up. That said, arguably had a pretty good night. No hits, no runs, no errors. And his closing statement, I think, was among the best when he listed those numbers.
Look, the thing for Carson is the debates almost don't matter. Ben Carson has not had a good standout debate in either of the four, and yet he continues to strengthen, he continues to rise. He's not looking to these debates to build his base. He's got a celebrated biography that is well known by not just Republicans, but all Americans. He is seen as someone who is calm, mild-mannered, that's appealing to a lot of people. He's seen as inspirational. He doesn't need a great, sharp, quick answer on, bank bailouts. The one thing I think that Carson has to worry about, though, is some of his answers last night on policy were really all over the map. And as a frontrunner, he's going to now face fact checkers who are going to really, I think, tear apart, particularly his answer on bank bailouts and on ISIS. They were all over the place.
It's not going to be about 10th grade, what he said in 10th grade, or some stabbing, or whether he hit his mom with the hammer on the head. It's going to be about what you do with X, Y, and Z, Russia. It was a little meandering.
Are we allowed to be uncharitable? Look, I love the guy. I mean, he really is impossible not to like, and to see him as a kind of a moral exemplar, somebody you'd want to hold up to your kids. He's got all that behind him. But on policy, I mean, are the Chinese really in Syria?
I don't think so.
I mean, you hear that, but it's not just that he got that wrong. It's that, what do you know about the Middle East that you would even think that? So, I mean, I do think at some point when you apply the normal standards that get applied to everybody else on policy, this is going to come crashing down. Will that moment ever happen? I don't know, but I assume at some point, let's say you're down to 2 candidates or 3, that's going to have to happen. And I mean, I can see that, and with Trump as well. You know, he pulls out stuff that is pretty unusual in relation to the facts, and nobody asks him about it. Is
that was good. Pretty unusual in relation to the facts.
I mean, now that's, you see how...
That is charitable.
You see how
diplomatic.
Do you see how we've lowered the bar? Even I can't say it. I mean, stuff that's wacko. Let's be clear about it. Send the email, Chris.
Send the emails to Charles.
That's a classic. I'm going to write that down. I think I'm going to use that in speeches.
That was a little
pretty
tortured.
unusual in relation to the facts.
Either tortured or diplomatic, one of the two.
One or the other.
But yet, you know, when I talk to him tomorrow, he will have a ton of support, and he does on the trail. And the question is, we are only 82 days away from the first votes in Iowa. It takes logistics. It takes a lot of, you know, people standing up in firehouses and schoolhouses across Iowa in the middle of the cold winter. Will Ben Carson and Donald Trump have the people to do that?
That's the big question about both of their campaigns right now. Carson has this almost ingrained infrastructure in Iowa that's based on homeschools, which is a huge network in Iowa, pastors. So some of that is built in for him. Trump, it's a little less clear. He seems to still be banking on the cult of personality, people just being sort of called to essentially caucus for him. So I think that you'll see more of an infrastructure problem for him. You know, some of these guys like a Jeb Bush, for example, a Ted Cruz, who spent a lot of time in Iowa, are banking that at the end of the day, these networks that they've been building will eventually put them over the top and then put an end to Trump and Carson. But, you know, look, I have been making some pretty bad predictions, apparently, about Trump and Carson for months now, and none of them have come true.
Look at this as a microcosm here. Signing up for all these state ballots, to be on the ballots. Alabama, Trump has 30,000 people come out to this stadium. He gets on the ballot in time, files the $10,000, the 500 signatures. Jeb Bush, for all his organizational strength, gives the $10,000, but doesn't have a full slate of delegates. Doesn't have the 500 signatures needed to get all the delegates if you win Alabama. So you have Rubio and all these other people who have the full slate if they win, but Jeb Bush among those who didn't file the signatures. That's what I don't get.
Well, and it's a problem for Jeb Bush, not only in practical terms, but it's also a problem because of the way that he's advertised his campaign, and the way that he's talked to his donors. He said, I don't need to be high in these early polls. National polls are meaningless. The early state polls, yeah, well, we'd like to be higher, but we're not worried about that. This is all about the long game, and in particular the SEC states. I'm going to do well there. I come from Florida. People will know me. That's where my support's going to be. And then you have a report like that. I think it's a huge problem. The big question, I think Julie's right, the big question for Carson and Trump, I agree with you on Carson. I mean, it's not at all hard to imagine Ben Carson winning Iowa because of that. I mean, it's the same network that Mike Huckabee used to do real well, Rick Santorum used in 2012 to basically win Iowa. You could see Ben Carson using that and using it effectively.
Which is why New Hampshire is now the holy grail of everything.
Which is why New Hampshire, right. I mean, why New Hampshire, people are focused on New Hampshire the way they are. The huge question, I mean, the biggest, in some ways, the biggest question of the Republican primary right now are the people who are showing up to see Donald Trump supporters, enthusiasts, or curiosity seekers, or what proportion? I mean, there's a mixture of both, no question. But what proportion? There was one poll, and I wish I could remember which polling organization did it, and it was an Iowa poll, and 68% of those who said that they were going to support Donald Trump were first-time caucus goers. Well, they're not all going to show up. I mean, caucus goers go habitually. It's a commitment to spend time at the caucuses.
It's cold. It's snowy.
It's cold. You're not going to.
It's horrible weather.
That night, he's not going to have 68% of first-time caucus goers as the base of his support. It's just not going to happen. Doesn't mean that he can't do well. It doesn't mean that he couldn't conceivably win if he can translate curiosity seekers into Donald Trump supporters.
All right, I only have a few minutes left. Who is the next to get out?
After last night, you would think Kasich.
Now, I mean, you include both stages.
Oh, I was assuming that we're down to 8, but maybe, yeah.
I mean, Christie's hanging in there.
I don't see him getting out. No, Christie stays.
But
Christie,
Graham, he didn't even make the stage last night. Jindal,
formally.
Santorum. They seem to be diehards.
I'm not sure anyone gets out quickly. It's pretty cheap if you're Bobby Jindal and you're just playing in Iowa right now. It's pretty cheap to roam around Iowa in a van.
But nobody is taking the Scott Walker admonition.
No one.
Get out of the field. Clear the decks. Let's, get the right person. No one listened to him.
I think because it's so wide open right now that conceivably, if you were on the main stage last night, and even if you're Chris Christie, you conceivably can see a path in your lane right now. And unless you see that path close off, I don't think that there's a real incentive to get out. J.S.
John says Graham is next. A couple people say Kasich.
Yeah,
Graham's having fun.
Yeah.
What about Bush? Does he stick around for voting?
I don't know that he sticks around for voting. I think last night, look, if you're Jeb Bush, you're at 5% in the national polls. I think last night
Bush.
He sort of stopped the downward trajectory of his campaign. Did he do enough to reverse it, to start an upward trajectory of his campaign? It's not clear that he did. I mean, certainly if you look at the first day news coming out of the debate, he's not likely to get a bounce from people saying Jeb Bush survived. Look, I'm not predicting Jeb Bush is going to get out of the race anytime.
Why don't you? It's only
online. Nobody will see it. I'm not predicting that. I mean, look, he deserves the opportunity to make his case and to make it as long as he wants to make it. But, for somebody who said he was going to campaign joyfully, I don't know how much joy you can have if you're mired at 5%. I mean, we're basically now at name identification numbers.
But I guess why isn't there any pressure for any of these other guys to get out? Why isn't there any, I don't know, institutional party pressure, voter pressure?
Because look, if you're in this, you have an outsized ego to start with. You have the example of John McCain in 2008. You have the example of this year, which is a completely crazy year. Who would have predicted Carson and Trump, lightning strikes? You have no idea what's going to happen. Hillary could get indicted. I don't know. But you imagine that there is some event that could change the whole dynamic. I don't think it's going to happen, and I think if you're the candidate, you've already invested 6 months of your life sleeping in really lousy hotels.
So you wait for votes. You wait for real votes.
If you can do it, as Julie says, if you can do it on a shoestring, like McCain, carrying his own stuff, baggage on the coach on the airplanes with one aide, why not? I mean, you're already in this for 6 months. Why not 2 months more?
But, like, for example, George Pataki and Jim Gilmore, they haven't qualified for primary ballots.
Yeah, but they're not really.
They're not in.
And eventually,
the Pataki moment is coming, though. You can't be so pessimistic. I keep saying the Pataki moment is coming. People just need to hear him more.
I tell you what, that is pretty unusual in relation to the facts.
I've got that written down, too.
Wait a minute. If I'm going to be pilloried for this, let me justify it with one incident, which is from the debate. When Trump said, we're going to let Putin go after ISIS, destroy ISIS.
Yes.
Bush followed up, and he missed the point.
Yeah.
He said, that's a board game. That's not the answer. The answer was that Putin is not attacking ISIS. I mean, it was a simple answer. It was a knockout blow, and it would have exposed, the entire Trump as a foreign policy, at least in Syria, as pretty empty, or as I happen to say as well, wacko. And that's the reason why Bush is doing so badly. He's had his opening and he missed them, and Trump just skates above this, even if he sometimes is at odds with the facts.
Sometimes at odds, or pretty unusual in relation to said facts.
There we go.
Panel, thank you as always. Thank you all for joining us for Special Report Online. We'll see you next week, we hope. Control room.